Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a good holiday weekend, although I guess holiday weekends are a little bit strange in this environment where we're all at home all the time. So welcome. This is the third session that we've run, as you know, and really what we want to do now is to actually turn the dial a little bit from just purely process and frameworks and actually start to think about behaviors. So today there's a little bit in around human behavior, around the psychology of how people think and how we can influence how they think. And hopefully then we can draw the dots between some of those thought processes and then how you might approach your negotiation. So we're going to look down at the 7 elements again, just a little refresher, just to keep that fresh in your minds. And then I'm going to share a range of tools that we can use to really help you, again, think about better engagement with your counterparties. We're going to think some more about how we can influence, and we're also going to hopefully share a model and a concept around how you structure your thoughts and ideas better to make your proposals to your clients more compelling. Okay, so that's really where we're going to go. As I've just demonstrated, my mastery of this technology is not great, so please unmute and ask a question. I'll try and answer as we go through. Send a chat if you can, although I'm conscious I can't see the chat, so I might rely a little bit on my end for that. And I'll try and stop throughout the materials just to kind of get some feedback from you all or hear some of your questions or thoughts on the material. So you'll remember this, this is the kind of concept that we think about when we're in negotiations, okay? So often what we observe with clients around the world, regardless of industry and regardless of the size of the business they're running, is that actually they see success in terms of somebody else's failure. So what we want to constantly do is challenge our thought process around that and challenge ourselves to actually think that success can be good for us as well as our counterparties. And actually, if we work towards that goal and that objective, we will ultimately find far more value than if we just set out to win something for ourselves on the assumption that to do that, our counterparties have to lose. So you'll hopefully now remember our 7 elements. I'm not going to test you. If we were in the room, I might do that, but we're not. So I'll let you off the test. But these are the 7 elements of negotiation. So interests, alternatives, options, legitimacy, commitments, relationships, and communication. And where we find these useful are in terms of how we think about setting goals and defining what good looks like in a negotiation, how we build our strategy and manage our preparation. And as we've said before, preparation is so important in just about everything we do. But in negotiation, it's incredibly important that we truly prepare and run scenarios for how our negotiations might play out and how we want to navigate ourselves through those negotiations. We also want to use these 7 elements for things like understanding and managing difficult tactics. So when we're up against those people who are just difficult to deal with, and I had one very early this morning in Australia with a client who'd put a proposal in, and pretty much all of the proposal was met with a no. And no was seemingly the answer to everything. So we've got to diagnose what's happening, why it's happening, and then navigate our way back to the table so that we can turn that no into a yes. I'm going to talk about some of those tools as well today. And we want to make sure, that we're constantly learning and developing our skill set so that every time we're in a negotiation scenario, we can improve and get better and generally build a skill and a capability. So this is our framework, and it's based on this premise that negotiation is actually an exercise in joint problem solving. So negotiation is actually about how do we sit down with a counterparty and solve a problem. And if we engage like that, we genuinely believe you'll find greater value and you'll get greater commitment and input from that particular counterparty, and you'll build a longer term working relationship. So I'm not going to belabor all the elements again, but needless to say, relationship and communication, very foundational to how we set up the right environment to do business in. Interests, options, legitimacy, the reasons we're at the table, the things that we could do together, and how we make those things fair and appropriate for ourselves and for our counterparties, all sat within that circle, the circle of value. When we're in those three elements, we're adding value to the negotiation. We're putting value on the table. And then the bottom two there, alternatives and commitments. So alternatives are all those things that you could do that you don't need your counterparty to agree to. Walking away, for example, choosing not to negotiate certain things, for example, they're all your alternatives. The best of those is your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And critical to remember there that your counterparty has those alternatives too, and has a BATNA as well. And so when you find alternatives being played, your job really is to make your alternatives look as strong and appealing as possible, whilst making theirs look as weak and less appealing as possible. And then commitment. So those things that we say and do that actually signify that we agree to something. And the message there is only to agree when you're ready. So nothing's agreed until it's all agreed. Make sure you don't get cherry picked to agree to some part of the deal today and then come back tomorrow and talk about the rest. You only want to agree to a deal when you can see all the elements of it and all the aspects of it, and you can make a rounded, holistic decision. And that's when we want to be making commitments. The only commitment we might make sooner than that is that one to agree to process. So to agree early on how we want to negotiate before we worry about what it is we're negotiating for. So try and set a process and get a commitment to the process as early as you can in your discussions. So there are 7 elements. Interest, you remember, specifically important that we remember that positions often show up at the table, but positions aren't interests, okay? So positions are things like price. So most negotiations aren't actually what we would recognize as negotiations. They are what we would call positional bargaining, haggling over numbers. And it's very easy for us to get caught at the top of that iceberg, just arguing over numbers. And that really is a very binary activity, and it normally only ends up one way, and that's with a downward price spiral that it's virtually impossible to go back on. So you will just lose value if you stay in positions. What we truly want to do is understand the underlying goals and the needs and the motivations and why people are at the table in the first place. Because if we understand that well enough, we can make some really interesting options about how we might solve those problems, how we might meet their interests. So this form of, this form of negotiation is known as interest-based negotiation, because this sits at the heart of it, this desire to truly understand what it is we're solving for, what the challenges of our counterparties are, and what our own challenges are, and how do we then make agreements that meet those challenges. And you'll remember we talked briefly about this. So this sort of what we call the negotiator's dilemma, this substance relationship tension, okay? And, you know, we need the skills to really negotiate both of these things. But what we don't want to do is heavily concede on one or the other. So we need to get that balance right. And depending on what you're negotiating for and who you're negotiating with, that purple line that says our goal, that might move a little bit north or a little bit south on this sort of chart. But what you're basically having to ask yourself is, how do I get the right balance between the substance, the value of the deal that I'm doing, what's it worth to me, and the relationship? How well do I work with this counterparty? What does that environment look like that I'm able to work in, and how much do I need to preserve that for future business or for other commercial reasons? And what we don't want to do is go all about relationship and give up substance to win a relationship. And equally, we don't want to be so focused on just what's in it for me that we forget about the relationship. So we've got to get that balance right. And oftentimes we find negotiators going heavily one side or heavily the other. So big organizations, for example, that have account management teams. Well, account management teams very often are all about relationship, and quite often they give away substance to maintain relationship. And we want to make sure that we are managing that more appropriately when we negotiate in this way. Equally, and I work with a lot of traders in the commodity space, for example, traders are all about substance and often forget that there's relationships. So they can build very bad reputations very quickly. And they might win today, but struggle to win tomorrow because they've ruined a relationship just for substance. So again, you've got to get that balance absolutely right. And then when we're dealing with difficult tactics, and we talked a bit about this last time, just a couple of messages here, right? I'm not suggesting you get on the table and do some yoga. I'm pretty sure that would break most health and safety guidelines. So apologies for the picture. So, but however, what we want you to do is what the Americans call go to the balcony. So stay centered and step back from it. Because what you're actually playing with here, when you're challenged with a difficult tactic, particularly if they're aggressive or they're rude or they're impolite, is that they will be triggering your emotional response. And you need to stay strategic and logical all the time. So the only way for most of us to do that is actually to remember to step back from it. And it could just be for a couple of seconds. It might be, actually, I'm just going to go get a cup of coffee, all right? But it's some way that keeps you centered so that then when you respond to that behavior, you are responding logically and strategically and not actually responding emotionally, because we want to manage that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that whole emotional side of things as we go forward. So when you're up against a difficult tactician, stay centered, slow it down, look at what's happening, and then stay strategic. Okay. And this is how we look at success. When we're in this mindset of thinking about the 7 elements, about thinking on...
Hi, Simon, it's Alan here. Hope you're well. Had a missed call from you to make sure...
sorry, can you mute, please?
You need something or you might have missed out. Anyway, if you want, you can check that.
Fine. Could you mute the phones? Thank you. Hopefully. Thank you. This is how we think about success, and it's an important definition, and it's important because it starts with the phrase no agreement. Okay, so our starting point is that we don't actually do a deal, which sounds counterintuitive given this is all about how we do deals. But what we want to do is say, look, there isn't an agreement. An agreement isn't feasible or sensible unless it's one that's better than an alternative, so something I could do with somebody else. Unless it satisfies my interests very well, the interests of my counterpart at least tolerably or acceptably, and the interests of anyone else who might have to live with the consequences of the deal we're doing at least tolerably as well. And that it actually is one of the best options of many that we've discussed, that it's legitimate so nobody feels that there's any unfairness in the deal, and it involves well-planned commitments that we can actually live up to. We'd like to think as well, of course, that it's a product of good communication, and it's got the right sort of relationship. So unless those things are in place, our advice is really don't do that deal. Go do the alternative. Go do something that meets your interests better. But don't stay at the table for a deal that doesn't meet these criteria. Okay, so let me just pause a minute there. Any questions on the 7 elements on that framework? Has anybody got an interesting example of how they might have tried to use it, or has it reshaped how they've prepared perhaps for a negotiation?
David, hi.
Hi.
It's Renat. Just a question on that. Should you share, or almost share that slide? I mean, you can do it in your own way, but should you share that with the person on the other side of the table?
This one, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, you could do. I certainly think you've got to share the intent of the slide. Again, I think, as I said before, I'm very keen on talking about how we want to negotiate before we worry about what we're trying to negotiate for. And there's some elements of that in this slide. I also think it's good to set out your stall relatively early on as well, in terms of here's what good would look like for me in this discussion. And you might want to kind of make it less academic sounding than perhaps some of the way we've phrased this, although I think this reads reasonably well. But I do think you'd probably want to set that out and say, for me, here's what it might look like. There's some other things I could be doing here. There's some alternatives, and I'm thinking about them. but they're not compelling perhaps yet. I want to hear what we could do together. Here's some of the things that are super important for me to be able to discuss with you that are part and parcel of why I'm at the table here today. Here are some ideas, and really start to address it in that way. You could share the slide. I certainly don't think it would do you any harm, as long as you can contextualize it very much into your own specific negotiation at that time.
Great, thank you.
No problem, thank you. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on?
So my challenge has been on trying to agree sort of a rebate with my customer. So they were coming back with things like initially we will expect 100% back if the candidate leaves within 6 months, which from a cash flow perspective it's not good. So I've gone back, and what I've proposed is they will still get the 100% back, but we'll get 50% back, and then 50% if they use me to place again. So that way I don't end up losing out 100%. So I'm still waiting to come back from them, but it's the first time I've had the confidence to go back with an alternative that I still think it's a win-win.
Yeah. So it's sorry, go on.
Yeah. So it's just an interesting one, because I think initially I would have caved because and said, oh, obviously my person's not going to leave. But then I thought, well, actually, in these times you can't predict anything. So it's better I put myself in a position where if it does happen, they will still get the substance of it back, but at least it means they would have to use me to replace. Yeah. Rather than I give them money back and then they use someone else.
Yeah. So here's where you're at, right? So when they're asking you for 100% rebate, they're sat here in commitments, right? Bottom left of this framework. They're trying to get you to make a commitment. And so as you'll remember, and it sounds like you have, hopefully, is our play when those things are happening, when we're outside the circle, is to get back into the circle. So what you've done effectively there, whether you've realized it or not, is you've gone back to options. Okay, so you've gone back into the circle and said, so here's something else we could do that might be more suitable. What you then also need to make sure you do, depending on their response, is then to also add legitimacy in there. And here's why it's appropriate. Here's why it's inappropriate for you to ask 100% rebate. And here's why I think this option could be perhaps more appropriate, and find ways that you can justify that. But in either of those parts of the discussion, you're back into a value-based discussion. And that's really the smart thing to do. It doesn't mean they're not going to jump straight back out and go, no, I'm sorry, it's 100% or else, which is them doing the alternative commitment play. Take it or leave it, right? Take it or leave it is an alternative commitment play. And you might have to try and get them back again. And I suggest legitimacy might be the route back in, to really try and challenge why what they're asking of you is fair. But it sounds like you're trying to make those moves around the framework, which is great. So hopefully your response, the response you get is favorable.
Thank you.
Beware on that one though, particularly with things like 100% or 50%, is actually you're at the top of the pyramid, the iceberg as well though. You're very much playing with positions if you're not careful. So just remember when you're doing that, because the first thing I'd say if you came back to me with 50% is, well, why is it 50%? Why isn't it 80%? And I'd start haggling, right? What you want to be able to do is really make sure you truly understand why 50% meets your interests, right? And just be ready to explain and share why it might be more appropriate and why it meets those interests, and why it might help meet theirs as well.
Yeah, I think I did basically said, look, you are still going to get back it. Yeah, I think I did set out why they're still going to be effective getting 100%, but it means from a cash flow perspective from both parties, and ultimately it meets them aim of not having to pay twice, so they will still get a candidate. So I hope I did set it out, but it'd be interesting to see what they come back with.
Brilliant. So just in that statement, right, you've talked interests and you've talked legitimacy. You're totally in the value circle there, and you're justifying why rationally and logically what you're proposing makes sense. So that's great. Good luck. I hope that comes back well for you. Okay, so we've got a series of tools now that are all broadly about how we influence. So how do we get ourselves across more effectively? How do we think more about the mindset of the folks that we are working with, and also think a little bit more about our own mindset as well. There's a bunch of strategies and tools that we're going to talk about. And I guess the smart piece here is to identify the tools and where they might help, and then selectively use the ones that you think most appropriate depending on the situations you find yourself in, right? So it's a toolbox. It's not suggesting you get all the spanners out, but it's suggesting here are some that you could use depending on the scenario that you're in. But the fundamental thing that runs through most of them now, and this is the sort of turning of the dial in our thought process, is we're really going to spend most of today thinking about the counterparty and trying to get into the head of the counterparty and start to think about how do I shape their thinking a little bit more towards where I need it to go. The first thing we're going to think about, I'll just build these slides, hang on, is communication. And we touched on this before. So this is one of our elements. So we talk about communication a lot, okay? And what we find is that there are these areas that we need to think about when we're communicating to make ourselves more effective. And then we're going to talk about some of the actual dynamics of communication. And communication is a very broad subject with loads of stuff in there that you could spend days literally studying and learning about, going right down to body language and all that kind of stuff. In fact, it was interesting on the BBC this morning that the analysis of one of the analysis of Dominic Cummings' little kind of Rose Garden coming out speech yesterday was about his body language and how his body language changed throughout that interview. There's a CEO that I work with who spent a lot of time in the special forces and learned a lot about behavioral science and about body language in particular. Probably because he was looking to see if someone was going to pull a gun on him. But what he's found is that actually when he's across the table in negotiations, he can use a lot of those techniques to see to what degree somebody's listening to him, or to what degree someone's perhaps in agreement with him, or to what degree someone might just be sat there thinking this guy's talking rubbish, right? So there's a lot in here, and I don't intend to go into all of it, but I'm going to give you a flavor of some of it. So we want communication to be clear, all right? And part of clarity to think about today is how do I speak in the language of my audience, all right? So how do I make sure that I can connect well because I'm speaking in their language? And that could be that I'm using words that are familiar in their industry, for example. So I work a lot in pharmaceuticals, so I use a lot of pharmaceutical terminology when I'm speaking to pharmaceutical clients, because it helps them understand me better, and it also demonstrates that I am, to some degree, connected and understanding of their world. We want to make sure we're concise and we focus on what's important, and we've got a little model that we're going to show you later that talks actually quite well to how we can be concise and effectively so. We want to make sure we've got the right context, okay? So we're providing enough background and broader context so that people understand we're where we're coming from. We want to be very consistent, avoiding the mixed messaging. We want to make sure we've got the right information and messages to the right people. So particularly when we're juggling maybe multiple stakeholders in a client, there might be different messages that we need to give to different people in different departments. And we want to make sure we're coordinated and aligned. And then, of course, we want to make sure it's as constructive as we can make it, okay? So it wants to be planned and executed very well and deliberately. We want to turn communication into not something that's an ad hoc dialogue between two people, but something that's highly structured with a strategy behind how and what we communicate. And these are the 4 dimensions that we think about, okay? So we think a lot about these, and there's no order, there's no ranking as to which one is more useful than the other. It really is scenario dependent. But I want you to think about the combination of these 4 things in every engagement that you have, even if it's a virtual one or it's a written or non-oral communication of some sort. So we want to think about inquiry. So asking how somebody else understands it, right? So I call this getting curious, showing a genuine interest and curiosity into how somebody understands something. And you'll think back to our 7 elements, and you can clearly see that when we're thinking about interests, for example, it's really important that we get curious and ask our clients, what's important here for you? Tell me about your business structure and give me some idea of how we might be able to help by having this negotiation and reaching some agreement together. Inquiry, ask questions, don't interrogate, be sensitive about how you do it, but get curious about what's important. The next thing's around acknowledgement. So understanding, and if there is one that I'd call out more than others, it's probably acknowledgement. I think typically people don't do it enough, right? So I think acknowledgement is demonstrating that you understand them, right? That you have an empathy with their situation. And as human beings, we kind of need that, right? We need to know that people understand how we're feeling about something, that they understand our point of view, that we've been heard. So acknowledgement is really important. And what often puts people off acknowledging in a negotiation scenario is that we feel like it's agreement, and it actually isn't, okay? So acknowledgement is in no way the making of an agreement. It is simply saying, yes, I hear you. I understand your point of view. I accept your perspective, and I see why you think like that, right? It's that kind of language, but it's really important that human beings hear that, because without it, they feel unfairly treated. And then we think about advocacy, right? So explaining how you understand it. Here's how I see this problem. Here's how I think we could fix it. Here's some of the things we could do to help this. That's advocating, and all of it very valid. What often happens in sales organizations is they forget about inquiry and acknowledgement, and they spend all their time advocating. They're normally so pleased that they've got some time with a client to try and talk about doing a deal, that they spend all of that time talking about what's great about them. And they don't spend enough time actually trying to understand much more about the client, and then acknowledging how the client is seeing things in a certain context. So it's perfectly justifiable that we advocate. Of course, we should advocate for ourselves and for our companies, but we need to get the balance right between inquiry and acknowledgement. And then finally, throughout all of this, we want to make sure we're listening, okay? So, and we're listening, we're not just hearing. So one other challenge with listening is actually, we need to demonstrate that we're listening, and that sort of jumps into a slightly grayed area with acknowledgement. You need to show that you're hearing what they're saying, rather than them just talking to a brick wall who doesn't say anything back. And you need to make sure that you listen with a mindset that says, I haven't already made a decision here. I need to hear what they're saying to me. So a huge amount of negotiations are actually started based on assumptions. They're started based on the assumptions that we think we know what somebody wants. And if we start there, that typically blocks us from really listening to what it is that somebody wants. And it therefore gives us less opportunity to really try and help them achieve what they want. So we need to listen with an open mind, not listen just to really try and reaffirm that what we thought we knew is actually the case. Okay, so keep that open and curious mind. And they're the 4 dimensions of communication that you've got to balance in every piece of communication that you do. So again, just quickly thinking about these. So be effective when you're doing these things, right? So think about inquiry, get the story, get the point of view, understand what they're thinking and how they see things. That's all what good inquiry is about. Questions like, what am I missing? You know, asking those things that don't feel like you're interrogating them, but it feels like you're getting them to share with you. And that's really what we want to do with inquiry. There's a phrase here called walking down their ladder, and I'm going to share the tool that's called the ladder of inference in a second, and I think it's really, really valuable for us. But we'll talk about that in a second, and it's really about inquiry. And then sort of, yeah.
Nish has just asked a question to say, is it okay to say I think, or should we base the negotiation based on examples and facts?
Well, I think both things, right? So I think you want to demonstrate you know stuff, right? And that you've got a fact basis for how you negotiate. But I think it's okay sometimes to open up and share that this is kind of how I'm thinking about this, and give it an air of it might be right, it might be not, but that's kind of where I'm at. And so I think that kind of language is okay. I think what we've really got to think about when we're planning our communication is, how well do I know the person I'm negotiating with? To what degree can we be less formal than more formal? And what could that engagement look like? And that will shape the sort of language that might be appropriate in that discussion. Okay. Some things about acknowledgement. So really the main thing here is to remember that acknowledgement isn't agreement. All right. So we shouldn't be afraid to acknowledge. Okay. We shouldn't be afraid to maybe paraphrase what we've heard. So give it back to somebody. Yeah, here's what I think I just heard you say. Is that right? And to test that you're understanding. And in doing that, you get more accuracy about what you understand from them, and you find out a little bit more, and that's always useful. But B, you also show them that you're listening and that you're paying attention and that what they've got to say is important to you. And so much of what we're talking about today is actually about human beings, how human beings interact with each other. So these things become really vital. So even the toughest, hardest negotiators are human beings, right? And so the thing to think about here is, how do I talk and engage with somebody who is equipped and built with all the same human emotions that I have? They might be wired in different ways, that some of them might be more important than others to them than to me, but I'm still interacting with a human being. And when you think about negotiations, actually at a certain level, companies cease to be a meaningful name for things, right? Because companies are just collections of people who do the same thing for the same organization. But actually in a negotiation scenario, it's much more important that you understand the people that you're dealing with, the goals and aspirations that they have, both personally and perhaps as an individual, as much as you may want to understand the stuff that's important from a company perspective. So anyone you negotiate with is going to have their own set of goals, their own things that make them successful, and their own things that are important to them, as well as the things that are important to the organization that they represent. And when you're negotiating, you're not negotiating with an organization, because at the negotiation point, the organization does not exist. The human being in front of you exists. And that's why we've got to get this balance right. Without becoming too psychological about it, we've got to get the balance right about how we interact. Advocacy, again. So this whole point of putting your story forward and your point of view, and perhaps allow it, again, depending if you think the environment is safe enough, allow your story to be tested, right? So you want to share how you see it, share what you think is important, and maybe leave some of it open for them to kind of test it. So yeah, because hopefully they're going to acknowledge and inquire as well, right? So yeah, I hear that, what you just said about what your company could do, but here's what I think I understand. And then you get into that value-adding discussion. Walk them up your ladder. We'll talk about the ladder in a second. And think about how things impact you and to what degree you share, the impact of actions on you and perhaps your organization. And then there we go. The last one is, again, just to think about this listening idea. So stay in the moment, be attentive, demonstrate that you're listening where you can, and a little bit like acknowledgement. So there are some tricks to doing this, right? So you don't always have to say things. So I find, for example, I write down things that I've heard, not because I necessarily need to write them down, but the act of writing something down in front of somebody demonstrates empathy, and it demonstrates that I've listened because I'm writing it down. If I'm being super cunning, I might write things down that I think I want them to think are more important to me than they actually are, right? So I have to be, you have to start to really think about the dynamics of this. So, but it's ways of demonstrating that you're listening, that you're engaged, that things are important to you. Try not to interrupt. And there's a concept here that we touched on before in the communication module, which is to think about accepting moments of silence. And sometimes it's okay, right? That actually we've all sort of said some stuff, we're kind of thinking about that. And so it's not actually that illogical that it might be quiet for a little while. The challenge is, particularly when perhaps we're not face to face, is that that's uncomfortable for people, right? So people get uncomfortable with that. So sometimes you might, if you need a moment to think about something or to write it down and you're not face to face, you might say, hey, yeah, I'm just writing this down, so that they know what you're doing. But it's okay that there's some silence now and again. What I don't want you to do in silence, and I think we said this back in the first module, is to fill it with concessions, right? So don't worry about silence, but what you shouldn't do is treat a pregnant pause like something you've got to fix, right? And actually lean in there with some concession or some giveaway, even if it's a low value one. Don't do that, right? Restart the conversation in a different way. And then the last thing here was paying attention to body languages and the messages that's sending. And again, I'm not going to go into the whole science of body language. There's a lot out there. Some of the things are pretty well known, like, you know, if someone's folding their arms or they're sat back away from the table, things like that might demonstrate that they are detached from what you're saying. So think about some of those things, but I'm certainly not going to belabor those things today. And then think about your purpose. And we always see these three kind of boxes that are kind of interrelated and interdependent. So thinking about making sure we've got objectives that are aligned and expectations that are aligned. So the more we can inquire, the more we can understand, the more we can align what we're trying to do with those of our counterparty. And we can align our expectations of our negotiation outcomes along with those of our counterparty. And we can do that the more we understand them. And that talks to digging underneath positions to find interests, using inquiry, and really getting curious. We want to make sure we know the audience, right? So the more we can research and find out about their organization, about the culture that they work in, about the sector that they work in, but then also about the individuals and how we can read the person so that we can make sure that our communication is very targeted and appropriate to the individuals that we find ourselves across the table with. And we want to be very clear on what it is we're trying to do. And often we actually forget sometimes what our specific purpose is, because we've not prepared and we carry around with us a sort of mental briefcase of all the stuff that's important to us. We often hope that we can pull the right piece out at the right time. But what we should do is plan and truly understand what our purpose is in our engagement so that we can structure our communication towards that purpose. And so there we go. So these are our guidelines for getting that purpose, right? So making sure we're deliberate, right? Are we on the right track? What we're doing meaningful and achievable? Are we focused, right? So we don't want a confused audience. Have we got the discipline in place to make sure we share specific things that are important in a specific way? Have we done enough to know our audience so that we can be convincing and share context and show that we understand their environment? And then can we make sure that we are clear and concise and that we avoid too much filler and padding in our dialogue such that we lose our purpose by trying to fill time? Okay, so they're just some thoughts on communication. Like I say, communication in itself is a whole science to some people. I think most people intuitively are built well to communicate. We just often forget to really rehearse and revise and remind ourselves about some of the things that are effective. So think about how you can use communication as a tool to get to where you want to go in terms of understanding what's important to your client. That speaks to interest in our negotiation framework, and it will open up the door to lots of different things you can do together, which speaks to options in our framework. It'll also help you with things like understanding their alternatives. The more curiosity you can show, the more you can identify the alternatives that are important to them, even if they don't directly share them. And that gives you the ability to work out strategies for how you make yourself look better than their alternatives. So there's a whole load of things that you can connect between communicating effectively and then how you play with the 7 elements and you shuffle that chessboard of elements as you're working through your negotiation. So we talked about this idea of a ladder and this is a tool called a ladder of inference, okay? So here's how it works. And it's based on this, and I'm pretty sure everybody's seen this picture before, but that doesn't matter. If we can just for a second. I'm just curious if anyone wants to share what they see on the screen now, please. Anyone tell me what they see? And you might have to unmute yourself. Anybody, what do you see on the screen?
David, I see a young lady looking over her shoulder, wearing a fur jacket.
Okay, so you see a young lady looking away from you, sort of back over her shoulder, yeah? Thank you. Anybody else?
I see a lady and an eagle.
You see a lady and an eagle. That's super interesting, Michelle. What sort of lady do you see?
She's got black hair, and she's facing away. She's looking away from us, and
Looking
she's wearing
away. So
a fur.
Yeah.
She's wearing a fur kind of coat or whatever she's wearing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So a sort of youngish lady looking away from you, a bit like Nish.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. And you see an eagle. That's interesting. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I see two pictures.
Yeah.
That's only because I've seen this before. So when I first looked at this picture, I only ever saw the elegant young lady.
Yeah.
Obviously looking away from us with a nice fur coat, you know, quite beautiful. That's all I saw. And when I eventually saw the old woman, I actually jumped out of my skin, because it was really good. And I'm not sure if anybody can see the old woman, but when you do, you think, oh my God. So now when I look at this picture, I always see both.
Yeah.
But it took me a while, so it was a real kind of paradigm shift for me.
So I think I see the old woman before I see the young one, but yeah, absolutely. And some of you might be looking at the screen going, there's an old woman there, and there is an old woman there, right? But here's the question really, because I know you've all seen this before. It's been used in these types of things for years. But the question that's really important, so if you see an old woman or a young woman or an eagle, which one of you is right? And of course, the answer is you're all right, because that's what you see, right? So what we want to start to think about in this section around influence is, how do we understand how somebody else sees it? Not because we want to spend our time telling them they are wrong, but actually because if we can understand how they see it, we are in a better position to try and influence and get involved in their world, and to actually tailor what we're trying to offer them or trying to sell to them or trying to help them with to that world that they see, right? So the eagle one's interesting though, because someone else has said an eagle to me, and but only once, and that was, I was doing some work for the First Nation community in Canada, in the States, in Canada, and it got me thinking about it a little bit, because there's an incredibly strong iconography about eagles to First Nation communities in Canada and North America. So I was wondering, and this isn't to share an answer, it's to share just a thought process as to whether, you know, our context dictates to a degree what we see, because I actually obviously believe it probably does. Because the other thing that, when you really think about this, so I shared this with a team in Singapore, predominantly Malay, Chinese, Singaporean cohort, who struggle a little bit to see those images, because of course they're very Western, white, European images. There's a sort of very, I guess, Edwardian sort of young lady turning away, and there's a maybe traditional old grandmother figure looking to the left. But they're very much only those things if you've grown up perhaps in a relatively Western environment, perhaps. I showed it to some folks in Greece, I think it was last summer, and somebody there saw Hercules, which sounded a bit cliche. And I said, now, I haven't just come to Greece for you to tell me that on this picture somewhere there is an image of a great Greek sort of hero and legend. But he pointed it out to me, and it sort of did. And so I'm wondering if context has something to do with it, which I think is interesting. but I'm not going to belabor it. My point being today is you see what you see there, and that's right for you. And the job of a negotiator isn't to turn somebody else to say that, to persuade them that what they're seeing is wrong. It's actually to align more closely to how they see it so that you can be more influential. And that's where the ladder of inference comes in. So, in fact, what we'll do is cut straight to that. So this is how we think, right? And hence the ladder, because there's a ladder on the picture, right? So here's how we think. We have information available to us. Okay, so down in the bottom there, in that blue sort of middle bit, that's slightly Venn diagram-y sort of thing at the bottom. We have information that's available. And then what we do is we focus on certain elements of that information. We interpret that information and we draw conclusions from it. And that becomes our story. All right, so at the top of the ladder is our story. At the bottom of the ladder is information. And as we walk up our ladder, we have a focus on certain bits of it. We have a way of interpreting it, and we draw our conclusion. And that becomes our story. And then based on the conclusion, based on the story, okay, we actually then go into a mode that screens out information that for some reason doesn't agree with our story. And we might come back to our information pool just to find things that reinforce what we think we already believe. Now, the classic environment where this typically happens is in politics, right? So, you know, particularly when you've got perhaps binary politics, like maybe Labour or Conservative, right? Is what we start with our story, right, at the top of our ladder, which is drawn from information that I've sifted and filtered and I've interpreted and I've drawn my conclusions. And then when I'm challenged on my politics, I run back down my ladder, find some more information, but only the information that re-supports my existing story. And hopefully that has a ring of familiarity with you in terms of how we behave, right? So when we're challenged on what we think and what we believe, we might go and look for more information, but we only actually look for information that supports what we already believe. And that leaves us at the top of our ladder with our story. Well, it turns out that our counterparties, of course, have a ladder as well. Let me just build this out. Hang on. So they have a ladder too, right? From which they've looked at information, they've sifted that information, they've interpreted that information, and they've got their story. And what's important here is if you look at those pools of information down below, you'll see the ladder sits partly in the middle and partly in the respective sides. So some of the information, let me just see if this builds. Hang on a second. Sorry, my computer's a little slow today. Yeah. So let's look at this one. So the information that you have available, some of it is mutually available. Both parties can see it, right? That's a middle sort of dark blue bit. But some of it is just information that you alone have. And they're the same, right? They have some information that only they can see and that you don't know about. The combination of those two pools of information are what you then focus on to create your respective stories. So your story at the top of your ladder and their story at the top of their ladder, based on information that you can both see and information that only one side of the negotiation can see. And what typically happens is we spend our time at the top of our ladders arguing about our stories. And the sort of gap, if you want to get really analytical on it, the gap between the two ladders is actually our zone of disagreement, right? So that's the area we disagree on. So we've got some choices to make, right? We could spend our time at the top of our ladder just arguing about our position, our story, and periodically running back down our ladder to get more information to support why our story is right and why their story isn't. Or we could do something different. And that's where we get into this idea of understanding and exploring reason, walking somebody down their ladder and walking somebody up your ladder, okay? And that's the kind of technique that we want to think about. We want to explore their story by understanding how they've reached conclusions, how they've interpreted things, and critically, what data have they focused on? And that's called walking somebody down their ladder. And at no point in that are you trying to tell them that their story is wrong. All you are doing is trying to understand that story and how they have got there. Equally, you then want to explain your story, and that's called walking them up your ladder, right? So share with them, here's the data that I was looking at. This is kind of how I see that data, and then therefore this is how I've got to this understanding of this particular challenge or this particular problem. And so it's this whole concept of not seeking to challenge somebody on the basis that they're wrong and your job is to prove that, but actually you're really just seeking to understand how they got to their story. And if we can do that, we can better align ourselves to help them understand why our story has perhaps equal validity or perhaps needs modification, and perhaps there are ways we can cross that zone of disagreement. But until we spend time doing that, we're always at risk of staying at the top of our ladders and just arguing over our stories. The kind of classic example of this, and apologies for using the B word here, but Brexit is a great example of this, I'm afraid. And for folks like me, unfortunately, Brexit is going to provide 1,000 case studies for the next decade. So forgive me for using one now. But so if you look at this, so look at me and my brother, right? So I voted to stay in the European Union and my brother voted to leave. And so if you were down in that data pool at the bottom in those blue circles, well, we've both got similar environments. We grew up together, you know, same parents, I think. And you know, we've got information that's common to us, right? But then he lives in a different part of the country. He's in a different industry to me. And, you know, he's got a different lifestyle to me. So he's got information and context that's just unique to him. And similarly, I have the same. But guess what happens when we sit down for a glass of wine at my house, right? And the B word comes up, is we're straight to the top of our ladders. Here's 1,000 reasons why he thinks we should leave the European Union. And I have 1,000 reasons why we should stay. And we just sit at the top of our ladder, and the more wine we drink, the more we stay at the top of our ladder, and we argue about our stories. We never ever spend enough time saying, "Sir, help me understand some more about how you see that. You know, what data was important to you when you looked at that decision-making process?" And that's not because my objective should be to change his mind, but if I can understand it, I'm less likely to be argumentative. I'm much more likely to be able to find ways to have an agreement or an environment where we could work forward from the situation. But typically we don't do that as human beings. I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's kind of resonates a little bit with folks. Any thoughts or questions before we move on? Okay. So that's what we call the ladder of inference, and it's about exploring each other's reasoning. Again, along with everything else, we'll get a pack together to share with you on all of these tools. But the real message here is, remember when you're arguing your point is you're probably at the top of your ladder. Your job isn't to convince somebody else that you're right and they are wrong. Your job is to simply understand why and how they have reached those conclusions so that you can work in that framework to try and find ways forward. Okay. When we think about influencing, there are a couple of things that we often see, all right? So we see common approaches, so tactical, for example, thinking that our job is to tell them all the reasons why they should say yes. Our job is to handle the things that they are complaining about, the objections they might have, and tell them why they're nothing to worry about and why we've got it covered. We might actually, you know, employ some debating or selling skills to prove that they're wrong to say no to us. All right. And then, so again, you can see a similar theme here where we think our job is to show that somebody's probably not thinking correctly. They're probably not right. They're probably worrying about something unnecessarily. And we want to just persuade them that isn't the case. Well, the results of that are actually that they might feel disrespected or pressurized. They might think that you're not listening to them. They might think that this is all about a win-lose persuasion discussion. Or they might well say no anyway, because actually they're finding the environment difficult and feeling like they're being unheard. So some of those tactics are actually founded in the wrong place. They're actually coming at things from the wrong perspective. Okay, so what we want to think about are tactics that are much more about seeking understanding. So understanding why someone's resistant, for example, which again speaks to our element of uncovering interests. We want to look for ways together that satisfy their interests, which speaks to our option of our element of options. And then we want to be persuasive and look at a joint problem-solving activity to really enlist them in the process, rather than have this slightly detached binary engagement where we just bat things back like a bit of ping pong. Okay, we want to enlist people's engagement in the process to finding solutions. And we want to demonstrate that we are the partner that they can work with to find those solutions. And if we do that, we know that folks will feel heard, like they've been listened to. They'll feel that they're part of the process and that they're engaged in it. And they'll find all the ways of getting to yes a lot more compelling and an easier route to navigate, because they're going to feel valued. So we want to think about that as an engagement strategy. And think about this as well, is that you can't change someone's mind unless you know where their mind is. So much of what we're talking about today is this whole concept of really understanding where somebody is, not because we want to change their mind, but because we want to help understand why their mind is in the place that it's in, so that we can influence it more effectively. Okay, so when faced with no, we say there's nothing more disempowering than assuming that the person you're trying to influence is stupid, crazy, or evil, right? So we often use that phrase, stupid, crazy, evil. My view here is no one comes to work to be stupid, crazy, or evil. No one sits down to negotiate with you to be stupid, crazy, or evil, right? And so your job is not to think that that's how they are, that's how they're behaving. Your job is to work out why they think the way they think and accept it as valid and understandable by getting deeper underneath why it is they have those thoughts and beliefs, okay? And remember that people do what they believe is in their best interests, regardless of whether you think it's a good idea or not. So constantly carry those thoughts, even with the most difficult practitioners that you deal with, the most belligerent people. You've got to assume that in their world, they're doing something because it makes sense to them and it's meeting their interests, and they believe it to be the right course of action. So try and understand it more. So if we were in the room together, we'd probably play around with a tool that looks like this. But this is one thing I want you to think about. It's actually a very simple concept, but again, we often don't give it enough time. So it's a tool called Currently Perceived Choice. And what this is really about is why it's actually much easier for human beings to say no than it is for them to say yes. So the predisposition of a human being when asked with a decision to make, oftentimes the negative, the no, has more positive consequences. And if your brain's as small as mine, you'll struggle with this because it's full of contradictions, right? So the negative response of no has typically positive consequences for the person who says it. Equally, and on the other side of the table, the consequences of a positive response, i.e. yes, often have negative connotations for the person who says it, right? So what we've got to understand is that it's far easier for somebody to say no to you because the consequences of saying no to you are all positive, versus saying yes to you where the consequences of saying yes are all negative. And this is very, very, very true of procurement people and people in buying roles. So if the buying decision is a yes or a no, as a buyer, it's 9 times out of 10 easier and better for me to say no than it ever is for me to say yes. So if you think about that as your starting point, what you can do is map out something that could look as simple as this and start to think about the perceived consequences. And these aren't necessarily the real consequences. These are the perceived consequences for your counterparty of those responses. Okay, so think about, who are you trying to influence? What do they likely hear me asking? And that's important. Not what you have asked, but what do they hear you ask? Because those things will be different. And then start to think about, what do they expect if they agree to me? And what you'll find is you're typically listing quite a lot of negative consequences. Equally, if they disagree with me, you will probably find quite a lot of positive consequences for them. So here's a classic, right? So I'm sat on the sofa at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. And sorry if this sounds like a sexist example, forgive me for it, but it's a kind of funny example of how this works. I'm sat on the sofa at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, and my wife says to me, can you put the bins out? It's a simple enough question, right? And it's not unfair or any of those things. But probably what I hear is not, can you put the bins out? I probably hear is, will you get off the sofa right now, stop watching the football on the TV, pick up a dirty bin bag, go out into the wet, cold outside and rook around in the shed, find the bin and put it outside for me at 10 o'clock at night in the dark. That's probably what I've heard. It's not what's been asked of me, but that's how I've heard it and interpreted it. So you can see, if I say yes to that, everything feels negative. I've got to get up, I've got to put my boots on, I've got to go outside, it's raining, so I probably should put a coat on, or I'm going to get cold and I'll probably miss this TV show I'm watching. Everything about saying yes to that has a negative. Whereas all the consequences of saying no are very positive for me. I don't have to do anything. I can continue to be a bit of a fat, lazy slob and stay on the sofa, and I don't have to put a coat on. Everything's positive, right? So it's a silly example, but what you can see is that I hear something that's not been asked of me, but it's how I perceive the question. I've then perceived what all the positives and negatives are, and the answer no has far more positive for me than the answer yes. Now, in the real world, we all know that if I say no to my wife, actually it's full of negative consequences. So saying yes is always the better idea. But you can see my point. So this is called currently perceived choice. And so here's an example. And again, we'll share this with you in the deck that we send out, right? So this is someone trying to ask a guy called Jack to write a report, I think is the example here, right? So, so you think about who we're trying to influence, and we need to understand that person. That's always one of our goals. And what do they likely hear me asking? And it's always in the present, right? So currently perceived choice is very much something of the now. It's very much in the immediate present. It's not about future, it's about now. So typically what they're hearing is something about, shall I now, or shall I today, or right now, shall I do this? And in this case, probably what you might have heard is, shall I give in to a ridiculous demand to deliver the report early just so someone else can look good, right? So I've been asked to do this report and they've said they want it sooner than I was planning. So here's what I hear. I hear that I've got to give in to this demand. It's a ridiculous demand, so I'm already on the negative. I don't like it, and it'll only just make someone else look good, right? So if I say yes to that, here's all the bad things that happen to me. I jeopardize my priorities. I have to work longer hours today. I'm going to reward their bad behavior, so they'll just ask me again. I set precedent, etc. If I was to say no, though, hey, that's good for me because I stay focused on my priorities. And if I do that, my boss will be happy. I'm standing up for myself, so I'm demonstrating the kind of character I have, etc., etc. So that's an example of currently perceived choice. So when you're in the selling mode, I want you to think about who you're influencing. When you're at the table, what are they hearing from you? And what's likely to happen in their mind when they perceive the consequences of saying yes? And once you identify those consequences, then of course you can start to work on how you reframe and reposition your proposal such that you are making yes more easy for them to accept than no, which I guarantee will be the default position they are in before you've even asked them the question. So this is where we get this whole concept of getting to yes, of why getting a yes answer is so much harder than getting a no. Okay, so think about this when you're next pitching your proposal, or you're working with somebody, a counterparty, or you're in your negotiation and you want to get to a yes. Think about why the answer yes for them will be negative, and how can you turn those negatives into positives? Okay. The next one, let me just pause again. Sorry, any questions or thoughts on ladder again, or on currently perceived choice? Hopefully they're things that resonate. Hopefully, again, you can see either in your personal life or your professional life where this idea that we have a story and we tend to stick to it and we only go and look for information to support our own story. Hopefully that resonates with you. And hopefully you can therefore understand that your counterparty will be doing exactly the same thing. And that there is value in understanding their story and how they got there versus just trying to argue their story down and make it look like it's wrong, with a thought that then says, then they'll like my story better, because that virtually never happens. And then equally, hopefully it resonates when you think about every time you've asked for an agreement or you've tried to get a client to get to yes, how many times have you honestly sat back and thought about, but what are the consequences for them? And in a buying environment, so if I was back in one of my procurement roles, to say yes to a supplier means I commit company budget, so I better be sure it's a good answer. It's kind of easier to say no. If the supplier messes up, it's my job that's at risk. So the consequences of the risk there are quite severe, right? So there's some negatives there. I've probably not done enough work to get the savings that I need from this supplier. So probably better to say no now, because I'm pretty sure they'll come back with a lower offer, etc., etc., etc. So constantly think about those things so that you can work with them, influence them, and mitigate some of those negative consequences of saying yes. So five core concerns, a little bit about human psychology, right? So the way we pitch this often is to say, there are 5 things you know about everybody before you've ever met them. All right, so all human beings, and we're back to this concept that the people we negotiate with are human beings. All human beings are pretty much equipped with the same things. And if we know that and we can identify what those things are, then we're already slightly ahead of the game even before we've actually met somebody. I'm going to, or I'll ask Mayank when we send the pack out, we're going to send a link to a video from a colleague of mine called Dan Shapiro. And he, along with another colleague called Roger Fisher, worked on these five core concerns. And this is the distillation of multiple human reactions and emotions down into 5 kind of buckets, I guess. But he does a 5-minute video, and it's incredibly powerful. And it's something you should watch before you go into any negotiation. And it's 5 minutes of your time. So just watch it before you go into any negotiation. A, because he's a very good, compelling person to listen to. And B, because when he talks about these things, he'll do it far better than I can. But he'll actually start to really get you interested in thinking about the human being you're about to interact with. And if you can understand a little bit about that ahead of time, you're empowered to be able to influence that person much more effectively. So these are the 5 core concerns: affiliation, appreciation, autonomy, role, and status. And we're just going to talk to each one briefly, right? But these are, think about these as 5 things you know about everybody, even if you've never met them. So the first one here is appreciation, right? So we're thinking about how do we create positivity in this environment, right? So people need to be valued and appreciated, okay? So what you've got to think about is when you're engaging with somebody and when you're thinking about how you build proposals and the content of your proposal, how does it demonstrate a level of appreciation and value for the individual that you're dealing with? Because we already now know, in the last 30 seconds, we've just taught ourselves that every human being needs appreciation. They will need it on a spectrum of really important to, yeah, it's kind of important, but they will all need it to some degree, okay? So appreciation's important. So how can you make sure that you've made your point well, that you're demonstrating that you appreciate the time and the effort and the involvement of your counterparty, such that you are really pulling on that lever of that emotional lever of appreciation? So first thing, everybody needs appreciation. How do you demonstrate it such that you're fulfilling that need that they have? Okay, next one is really around affiliation. So to what degree is somebody connected? Are they inside or are they an outsider? All right, again, people have different needs in terms of their sense of affiliation. Some people need to be desperately involved in everything all the time. It's important to them. Some people less so. So you might not know the finite degree to which somebody needs affiliation before you meet them, but you know that they need some degree of connectivity. So find out those ways that you can cultivate and build connection, connectivity. How is somebody involved? How is it maybe some involvement that we have in something outside of the work environment, if you think that's appropriate? How is it a direct involvement in the proposal that's on the table or the proposal you're working to? To what degree do they need to feel involved? Some senior managers, for example, are extremely good at delegating, and that's because they can live with less affiliation to a specific project than others, and they're very good at allowing somebody else to run with that. Others simply can't do that. So you need to think about to what degree do these individuals need to feel connected with the proposal, the project, the idea, the product, the service, whatever it is you're proposing. The next one's around autonomy, all right? So to what degree is somebody controlling or not controlling? And again, people have different needs in terms of their control, all right? But people typically want some degree of engagement and ownership, and they want some degree of autonomous control over things that impact them. So you want to make sure that you foster that autonomy, that you create an environment where there is the right level of ownership for people to feel like they've got some stake in it that they control, because control is important. Again, on a spectrum, control is important. So think about how you might be able to do that when you're building your proposals. Role, right? So people need fulfilling roles. How do I create opportunities for people to contribute? How do I relate the individual roles to perhaps the larger purpose? Here's why your role in this process, this project, this proposal is super important, because it does X, Y, and Z. How do I create the right role, the appropriate role for somebody when I'm thinking about my engagement with them? And finally, status, right? So does what I'm proposing actively move their status up or down, for example? Is the way I'm pitching this actually going to impact their status negatively? In which case I need to think about how I present that, because nobody wants their status to be demoted, right? They might not want it to be significantly elevated. They might not have that kind of ego, but they certainly won't want it to be demoted. So think about the status of the people that you're going to talk to, and perhaps how what you're proposing or how you want to work with them actively promotes the status of that individual or individuals. So there's 5 core concerns, 5 things that everybody in the world has in their head to some degree, and 5 things to think about when you're building proposals and engagement strategies with some of your clients. And again, we'll send you the link. Watch Dan talk about this for 5 minutes, and I think you'll get a really good insight. In his world, it's the 5 minutes that you're at. If you do nothing else before a negotiation, they're the 5 minutes you should spend your time on thinking about, what am I putting on the table, and how does it trigger these 5 things in the right way, such that that human being that I'm talking to has got that positive emotion coming out of the discussion. Okay, I'll stop there just for a minute, and then we're going to talk about, I think, the final concept today, which is a thing called the hierarchy of ideas, and how we pitch, perhaps get more effective in pitching our proposals. But before we move on, any thoughts or questions?
David, I've just informed everyone that we may be overrunning and extended, so we can aim to finish by maximum 11:45.
Okay, I think we'll be okay, but okay, yeah, okay. That yeah. I appreciate that, and continued apologies to everybody that I talk too much and we run over too far. So I will do my best for the 11:30 slot, but hopefully no more than 5 minutes over, if that's okay for everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, the hierarchy of ideas. There was, or is, a business consultant called Barbara Minto. I think she's retired now, but Barbara came up with a concept called pyramid thinking. And some of you might have read a book, there's a book on it, equally titled Pyramid Thinking. And it's really about how you structure ideas. And it's how you make your ideas more communicable and more effective when you do communicate them. So we're going to touch on the principles of that for the next few minutes, because I think it would be useful for you when, again, you're thinking about how do I pitch effectively, and how can I tie in some of the other tools we've been talking about, some of the communication strategies we've been talking about, really into an effective methodology for building compelling pitches to my clients. So this is the hierarchy of ideas. It's a simple concept like most things, and we'll explore it a little bit today with the time that we have. So one of the common challenges with proposals or reports or any other communication is that actually the ideas that we have get lost because we haven't put structure behind how we compose and put things together. And so we might have a main idea, and underneath that there are these sub-ideas, but actually not all the sub-ideas connect to the main idea. Some of them a little bit, some of them not at all, some of them actually are totally aligned. But actually what we have is a bit of a patchwork quilt of effective and ineffective sub-ideas that get thrown into our proposal, but don't necessarily always support the main pitch or the main idea. So typically that's what we see, this disconnection. Equally, at the sub-idea level, what we see is actually there's very little relationship oftentimes across those sub-ideas. They might be like islands of thought rather than actually a whole continent of ideas that sort of gel together. So we get disconnection horizontally as well as vertically. And this just creates confusion. And it means that the things that we propose, no matter how good we think they are, actually come across as less compelling than they could do. So that's the kind of basic premise. And as an example here, you know, maybe if a business was thinking about why they lost some market share, right? They might have all these ideas as to why they lost, some of which might be absolutely right, but maybe traditional competitors cut pricing. Well, that clearly is a link to why you might lose market share. But exchange rate variances, for example, well, that might not really have anything to do with market share at all. It's certainly a business problem that you're probably wrestling with, but might not be directly connected to why you lost market share. So you can see that it's easy to get this disruption, this disconnection between the kind of sub-idea level and the main idea. And then across those sub-ideas to have a whole variance of things that actually don't necessarily tie into the main idea that we're thinking about. So a hierarchy of ideas straightforwardly looks like this, and this you'll recognize as an organization chart. So it's a similar concept, okay? So this is how we want to start to think about building our proposals. And there's a couple of key lessons in this that I want us to listen to. So the firstly is the structure, okay? So the structure here is around the vertical. So each level summarizes the logical groupings that we have below them, all right? So we want our logical groupings below our main idea to all make sense. And there could be 3 or even 4 layers of these sub-ideas that need to be thought about and grouped logically. And that gives us this kind of virtual structure. And then what we also want to think about is this horizontal structure. So our sub-ideas must be logically and structured horizontally as well as vertically. So for example, if we look at the cluster on the left of the screen there, you know, underneath our main idea, we've got a sub-idea, and then we've got some more concepts that sit underneath that. Those things in their little cluster need to make sense, but they need to be related sensibly to the other clusters that you also design. So this could be, for example, chronology. It could be a timeline. It could be, you know, at this particular time, this is important. Later on in the project, these things are important. Further on in the project, these things are important. But you need, where possible, to find a logicality as to how these things hang together. If you don't do that, this is just a random bunch of thoughts that you've tried to cluster into a concept. And whilst the concept might be great, if the thoughts beneath it are unstructured and relatively randomized, you're always going to be less compelling than you need to be. So a couple of simple things to remember, right? So each level summarizes logical groupings below, and the groupings below and explain and support the level above. So your foundational ideas support the main idea that builds upon them, and equally your main idea is supported by those things below it, the foundational concepts. So here's the kind of main twist when we think about building a hierarchy. And again, if we were in the room, we would have a big sheet of paper with that type of drawing on it, and we would be building your proposals based on that type of diagram. So do this in your office, in your workplace. Think about a structure that looks like an organogram like that. And here's the key, one of the key messages: start from the bottom. What typically happens is we think we've got a great idea, a great proposal, and that's our big box at the top of this hierarchy, and we start there. And then we find, a bit like our ladder of inference, lots of things that we think make that big idea look great, okay? And actually that's where we get disconnect, because all we're actually doing in that exercise is supporting why our first big idea was so good. We're not really testing it, and we're not building it logically. So like building any structure, start at the bottom when you're creating this, all right? Think about all your ideas and your pitch and your value story and all of those things, and gather them together. And it's a good thing to do with Post-it notes, actually, so you can move them around. And then logically order them into your subcategories and your categories, and then build towards your main idea. And I promise you, if you do it this way, actually your main pitch, your strapline, your key concept might look quite significantly different than you thought it would. So if you start at the bottom and build, effectively your structure will dictate what that big pitch should look like. If you start at the top with your big pitch and then just find things beneath it that might support it, it's always less compelling. It's like building a house without foundations. So one of the key lessons here is when you're building a hierarchy, start at the bottom, collect your ideas, your thoughts, your data, your inputs, order them logically, and then make sure that as you build up, you're summarizing that logic to get to your main pitch, your main concept.
David,
yeah.
Hi, it's Michelle.
Hi.
I wondered what your, this is interesting, the hierarchy approach. I use mind mapping to flesh out ideas. So I just sort of, which starts with the central thought or idea and then builds out, and then you can create that connectivity between all of the pieces. So I wondered how that is different or relates to what this hierarchy approach is.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So I think if you do mind mapping, what you'll find yourself getting closer to is a lot of those smaller sort of boxes on the bottom of the pyramid, right? You'll start to identify a lot more of those. Some of them you'll dismiss because you think, actually, I think that's interesting, but not relevant, right? But some of them I think you'll uncover. And I think mind mapping's a fabulous exercise. But what I wouldn't do is start a mind map with my pitch, right? I wouldn't say, right, here's why, you go and hire Michelle tomorrow, right? Here's why Michelle's company offers the best product in this particular range, whatever it is. I'd start with something different in a mind map, but a mind map might get me some of those lower boxes that I can then organize and regroup to build this structural foundation to whatever my pitch needs to look like. And part of all these tools is the process of being deductive, right? So we want to find out by discovering. We don't want to start with the answer and then make everything, meet the answer. We want to start without an answer in some cases and build towards one based on the facts and the thought processes that we engage in.
Okay,
Does that help?
So do you suggest probably using a combination, or start with using them both? Then
yeah, I think in all cases absolutely do that, and do some of the other things as well, like thinking about how does the company I'm pitching to behave culturally, how do the people behave, what's important to them, think about some of the 5 core concerns, where in this might we be looking to demonstrate empathy or autonomy, or think about all of those things, and treat this as a toolbox where you can pull things out to help reinforce or uncover or explore some ideas. And then when you're at this stage, you've hopefully then got a whole load of things that you could cluster into subcategories, and some which you'll actually logically then realize aren't relevant, yeah, and some that you'll realize are far more relevant than you expected them to be. And that's the principle again of building from the bottom up based on a whole range of ideas and concepts that you might have uncovered.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. So we start from the bottom when we're building, but here's the critical learning piece, right? When you're communicating it, so when you're pitching, you start from the top. So when you're building this in your office, sat at home, whatever your environment is, you start at the bottom and you build your structure and you put logic to your structure and it makes sense at every level. And then you get to your main concept. And you need to be open-minded that your main concept might be different from the one you thought it would be when you started out. But then critically, when you're pitching, is you start at the top of your pyramid and the top of your hierarchy. And you hit that with a very strong, clear message. And only then do you share some of the detail below it as supporting facts, data, and evidence as to why that big pitch is relevant, appropriate, and good for your client. Never start at the bottom and talk about lots of ideas, because that's confusing. You will lose your audience straight away and you will lose the flow of the logic. Start at the top with something clear and concise. Remember our communication advice earlier on. Clear, concise, definitive. Be very prescriptive in that initial pitch, but start at the top of your pyramid. So those are the two pieces of learning. Always build from the bottom and open your mind to the fact that you don't yet know the answer. And then when you've built this and you're pitching it, start at the top with a very clear, incisive pitch, and then use the other layers of the hierarchy to support that pitch with facts, data, evidence, etc. Okay, and here's the last piece that we'll talk about, and it's really just a kind of thing to think about again when you're pitching in those ideas. It's about storytelling, and we've got some really interesting material on this, and if you read a lot like I do, then you might recognize some of this. But you know, in a lot of cultures, history was never written down. It was an oral, and is an oral tradition, and it's an oral tradition that survives because people have turned it into stories, right? And so what we know about stories is that they're pretty timeless and they're very easy to remember if they're constructed well. And what you want to make sure you do in your pitches is leave something behind that's memorable and that people have bought into and they've got involved and engaged in, right? So think about the narrative of how you pitch. Think about how good stories, it could even be, you know, fairy stories or folk tales from your childhood or whatever they are. They could be the Gruffalo that you read to your child, but think about why those stories are successful and compelling. And nearly always you'll find that they are relatively simple in their structure. They've got some degree of timeless quality about them, which means they can survive time and be memorable. They've got something that's contagious or infectious about them. So they've got that ability to be told and retold because there's something there that's important. So think about how you can build that narrative, because you want to make your ideas come alive. You want to make sure that you can facilitate complex ideas into and distill them into things that people will remember. You want to connect emotionally to a degree with your audience. So you're pulling them in, you're buying them in, you're bringing them into the journey. You want to make sure that your ideas remain in their consciousness and stick with them. Okay, so think about the storytelling process when you build your pitches. And even though your story is probably a PowerPoint presentation, think about it like you were writing a story down. And some of those things are important, right? So context, who, where, and when, who's the protagonist? So what's the challenge that we're dealing with, right? So obviously you're not writing a story. In this instance, you're writing a proposal, but some of the elements are still the same, right? So what's at the center of the story, or who's at the center of the story? which companies are at the center of the story, what are the challenges that we're facing, and what's the thing that might help us overcome that challenge. What do we need to do? What are the actions that we need to do, both parties, to make those things come to life and be real, right? And who needs to do that? And what will the outcomes be, and how will we measure those outcomes and hopefully measure that success? Okay, so think about that formulaic way of putting together a proposal, but as if you were telling a story, because that will help it meet some of those other criteria where it's memorable, where people feel involved, where it's about something that's important and interesting to them, and it gets to a conclusion that feels satisfactory, feels like it's meeting some challenge or issue that somebody was facing. So think about the storytelling. And the last two slides of these, right? So when you're starting any story, any proposal, start strong. And by starting strong, we mean some of these things. Maybe pitch in an open-ended question, right? Not a yes or a no question, but something more open-ended, a dilemma, a challenge, something that you believe you're wrestling with to help this client, right? It could be something you take from their RFQ document, but it's about understanding or showing you understand what their challenge is, but positioning it as maybe as an open-ended question. And then start to think about options and imagining things that you could do that help to work with that challenge. Or perhaps a bold statement, something big that catches their eye. And then maybe turn it into some experience that you've had, perhaps, about a similar event that you've dealt with. And maybe think about where you get some hard evidence. So I'm not saying use all those 5 in every start of every proposal, but think about 2 or 3 of them and how they might work to make the introduction and the opening point of your proposal compelling and engaging, a bit like reading the first few pages of a good book. What makes you turn to the next page? What makes you turn to the next chapter? I was listening to an author on the radio recently, and there is apparently in novel writing an unwritten rule that says the plot has to turn every 4 pages. So in any book, the plot has to have a twist or a turn or a change point in it every 4 pages. Otherwise, people don't keep reading. So again, with a storytelling mindset, think about some of those dynamics when you're starting it. What's going to make them read the next page of your proposal or look at the next 3 or 4 slides that you've sent? And equally, you need to finish strong, right? So how well are you summarizing it so it's concise and memorable? Perhaps think about a call to action. Here's what we need to do on the back of this proposal. Think about something you can leave behind, like a quote or something that they'll remember. And then kind of wrap that up in some kind of finality. So again, not necessarily all of them in every proposal, but some of them in your proposal, so that when you finish and you leave, whether it's something they've read or something you've presented, how well will they remember and take forward what you've been saying to them? Okay. I think that's it. So we're sorry we're 5-6 minutes over. Happy to take any questions or any other thoughts today. Hopefully that's been useful. And as always, a pleasure talking to everybody.
David, one question Mrinal has asked is, what one book would you recommend from all the business ones you have read?
You know what? I haven't read a lot of business books, right? I'm not a business book reader, but I have to tell you about one called Getting to Yes, which was written by the partners and the folks I work with, who then went on to found a Harvard negotiation project. So Getting to Yes is, I think it's been a bestseller in the New York Times list for about 30 years. Have a read of that by all means. It really talks about interest-based negotiating and the 7 elements extremely well. So I would certainly recommend that one. I actually think that sometimes the best advice comes in other places, right? So it does come in the stories that you read. Why do you go back to stories all the time? So I have certain books that I reread a lot, right? Partly because they've probably got a good tale behind them, but partly because there are things that happen that are compelling to me. And I think if you look at successful novelists, they often have a formula for things that are compelling to their audience. And so when you're pitching to clients, you want those same things. You want compelling things that mean the client will read a pitch from your company again and again, because there's something in it. And when you send your next one in for the next piece of work, they know well enough that there might be something in there that's interesting. So think about some other, perhaps those hooks that you could maybe get into your proposal writing.
Thanks, David. Just which of those books that you keep rereading?
Oh my God. Okay. Well, I've got a whole load on my shelf back here. So
Yeah.
I've got, gosh, do you really want me to answer this question? It's going to be embarrassing now. So I reread Foucault's Pendulum a lot by Umberto Eco. I reread Ian Forster's Room with a View a lot. And there's a couple right there for you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Maybe when you send a deck out, final deck presentation, maybe one slide on some of your favorite books.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, and I have got a list of recommended reading for negotiators. So, and I'm just embarrassed that I don't typically read those. I've always historically just got more involved and learned from people I've been lucky enough to work with. But we'll certainly add that to the deck, Mayank. Yeah.
David, I have one question, and this is more about as procurement goes more, using technology with so many different platforms. Although there is a big focus around in the last few years about supplier relationship management.
Yeah.
At the same time, it contradicts what procurement is now going big time with technology, using different platforms like SAP platforms. How do you marry those two, and what's the...
Yeah, and it's genuinely the dilemma that you deal with, because, again, I remember the inception of a lot of those technologies back in the 90s, things like reverse auctions, that kind of stuff. And very transparently, a lot of the goal was to depersonalize the process. And part of the depersonalization of the process was to make sure that buying decisions were made purely on facts and data, and not made on perceptions and opinions and relationships. Now, some of that's still valid, of course. You would hope that buying decisions are made on facts and data. So you always need to be really good on your legitimacy, on what's important and what's factual about your proposal and why you're a valid potential supplier. So those things don't go away. The challenge becomes, how do you get engagement when procurement insists on putting technology between you and them? One of the answers to that is to broaden, and we spoke about this, I think, last time, broaden your stakeholder environment. So find other people that you can talk to in those organizations, or in some way get through to and connect with to influence. And really think about, because when you think about it, procurement buy very little for themselves. They're buying it on behalf of a business. So they're a representative at best. And in most cases, they're only partly a representative. There are very few businesses where they are the only arbiter of whether a supply decision gets made or it doesn't. And so you've got to find out who are those other people who are truly important in the decision-making process, and find ways to get to them, because they may not be shielded by quite so much technology. However, I know it's very difficult to get to those people, but very difficult, actually. And they are shielded by lots of ways that stop you getting to them, which makes your task very, very difficult. The other thing I'd say, though, if you're faced with technology, is don't be bullied by it. You've got to stick to your principles. You've got to stick to your mantras and your rules and things that are important to you. If it's about pricing, you've got to stick to pricing that's effective and sustainable for you, and not get tempted to lower your price to something that is not where you need to be or is not sustainable. And then you've got to think about this concept of alternatives. Do I want to engage with a company that puts technology between me and the client? Not do I have to, or do I feel compelled to because it's a big company and it would be super impressive to have them as a client, but do I need to? Is it a business imperative for me? Or are there alternatives that are more compelling when I really analyze it? So think about your alternative strategy. And sometimes that pitch to, a GSK might be more trouble than it's worth and hard for you to achieve, especially if then technology is put in as a barrier to you getting to know the right people. So think of where your alternatives might be better than that.
Thank you so much. I think we are just around 11:45. So, all I have to say to you, David, is a huge thank you from everyone. This has been invaluable 3 sessions. I know we could have done so much better if we were face to face, but I'm sure with our long association with everyone and with you especially, we'll have some time to come back again face to face and run these kind of workshops on a regular basis. But from every one of all of us, a big thank you. And to everyone who has participated, we will be sending out a shorter, truncated version of the deck to everyone within a week's time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to everybody. It's been a pleasure talking to you all.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.